The blade was already at Marina Davenport's throat when Constantin Vere walked through the door. Not a metaphorical blade, not a figure of speech. A very real, razor-edged silver dagger held by a vampire who had the kind of smile that belonged on the face of someone who had spent 3 centuries perfecting cruelty. His name was Aldrich Selene, and he was the second most powerful creature in the room, which meant he was currently the most dangerous one, because the most powerful creature in the room was still standing in the doorway with rain on his shoulders and murder in his silver eyes. "Let her go," Constantin said. His voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. Every person in that underground chamber, human and vampire alike, understood immediately that quiet was not the same as calm. Marina did not scream. She had been a commercial artist for 6 years, had survived 3 near muggings in Manhattan, had once talked down a gallery owner who had tried to claim legal ownership of 12 of her paintings through a forged contract, and she had been inside the vampire court for exactly 47 days. She had learned very quickly that screaming accomplished nothing down here. What mattered was information. What mattered was keeping her eyes open and her mind working. So Marina kept her eyes open and her mind working, and she counted 6 other vampires arranged around the chamber, and she noted that the silver dagger Aldrich, pressed against her skin, was trembling slightly, which meant Aldrich was afraid even as he played at being powerful. And she noted that the document still clutched in her left hand. The document she had been in the process of photographing with her phone when Aldrich had appeared from the shadow behind the stone pillar was exactly what Constantin had asked her to witness and record 3 days ago. "Lord Vere," Aldrich said, his too smooth voice echoing off walls that had been carved from the bedrock beneath Midtown Manhattan, sometime around the turn of the 20th century. Back when the first vampire lord of this city had decided that the growing human metropolis above made excellent camouflage for an ancient court. "Your little human is trespassing in a private archive. Blood law permits me to claim her." "Blood law," Constantin said, stepping forward once, his white hair catching the amber torchlight, his long coat moving like something alive behind him, "permits you nothing where she is concerned. She is under my aegis. My seal is on her invitation to these archives, and if you press that blade 1 millimeter closer to her skin, I will remove your hand at the wrist, and then we will have a very different conversation." It was not a threat. Marina understood that now after 47 days. When Constantin Vere said something in that quiet voice, it was simply a statement of what would happen next. Aldrich knew it too. The dagger trembled harder. Marina used that trembling half-second to duck her chin, tuck the document inside her jacket, and step sideways out of Aldrich's grip with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent 3 weeks asking a court guardian to teach her basic evasion, because she had understood almost from the beginning that in this world, understanding was not enough. You had to be able to move. She crossed the chamber floor in 12 steps and stood behind Constantin's left shoulder, breathing carefully, because her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough that every vampire in the room could almost certainly hear it, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shake. "The document she carries is a forgery, Lord Vere," Aldrich said, regrouping, smoothing his gold-embroidered jacket with the precise movements of someone reassembling his dignity. "And she is the only human who has seen it. Under blood law, a human witness to a false court document can be silenced without tribunal." "Except the document is not a forgery," Marina said, before Constantin could respond. Every head in the room turned toward her. 6 vampires with ancient eyes and no patience for human opinions. Constantin turned slightly too, and she caught just the edge of his profile, that sharp, beautiful, dangerous face, and what she read there was not surprise. It was something quieter and more complicated than surprise. "The watermark on the primary seal is Aldrich's own family mark from the 1880s, Marina continued. Because she was an artist and she had spent the past 3 weeks studying every document in the archive Constantin had given her access to, not because he had asked her to, but because she could not look at a piece of paper without wanting to understand its construction. The ink composition matches archival samples from Lord Vere's court from the same period. The handwriting on the secondary witness line belongs to Councillor Valeth, whose signature appears in 7 authenticated documents I have personally catalogued, This document is entirely authentic, which means it proves that the Treaty of Territorial Rights Aldrich is currently contesting in front of the High Council was never, in fact, disputed by the original parties, which means Aldrich's entire legal challenge is built on a claim he already knows to be false. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Aldrich's composure cracked just slightly around the eyes. Constantin turned fully toward Marina then, and for one unguarded moment before he reassembled the cool, regal mask he wore in public, she saw something move across his face that she had no name for yet. Something that looked almost like awe. She would think about that look for a long time afterward. The night did not end quietly. Aldrich's attempt to claim blood law jurisdiction over Marina collapsed the moment she produced the authenticated document. But Aldrich was 300 years old and had not survived that long by accepting defeat gracefully. He filed an emergency petition with the High Council within the hour, arguing that a human with access to court archives and demonstrated knowledge of vampire blood law constituted a security violation under the ancient codes, and that Constantin was either complicit in a breach of the Compact of Vale, which governed relationships between the vampire court and human civilians, or dangerously negligent in his management of a human asset. The word asset was the one that made Constantin go still in a way that Marina had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than visible anger. They were in his private study by then, on the 34th floor of a building in the 50s that looked from the outside like a boutique architecture firm, and from the inside like someone had transported a 19th century Viennese manor house into the body of a glass tower. Rich dark wood, bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling and held volumes in 6 languages. A single painting on the wall behind the main desk that Marina had identified within 3 seconds of first seeing it as a Klimt that the art world believed had been destroyed in the Second World War. She had not said anything about the Klimt for the first 2 weeks. Then one afternoon she had walked up to it with her coffee cup and stood there for a very long time, and Constantin had come to stand beside her, and she had said, "The gold leaf technique in the lower left quadrant is slightly different from his work in the Adele portraits. He was experimenting. This was done privately, not on commission." And Constantin had said very quietly, "Yes. He gave it to me himself in 1910. He said it was practice, but I believe he knew it was something more." That had been the first time Marina understood that she was not simply in the presence of something dangerous. She was in the presence of something ancient that had been lonely for a very, very long time. Now she sat across from him while he read the petition Aldrich had filed, and she watched the controlled stillness of his hands on the paper, and she said, "What does the Compact of Vale actually say?" Not the summary version, the specific language. He looked up at her. "You never stop," he said, and it was not an accusation. It is a straightforward question. The Compact of Vale states that no human civilian may develop operational knowledge of vampire court law, territorial claims, or internal power structures without being formally designated as a court-bonded witness or advocate. The penalty for the human is removal from proximity to the court. The penalty for the vampire lord who permitted the violation is review by the High Council and potential loss of territorial sovereignty. Marina set down her coffee cup. So formally designating me as a court-bonded witness or advocate would resolve the legal issue. Constantin looked at her for a long moment. "It is not that simple. I understand there are complications. I am asking you to explain them." He rose from the desk and moved to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, with the particular quality of stillness that she associated with him when something was costing him more than he wanted to show. The city lights caught the white of his hair and turned it silver blue, and his profile against the glass was so perfectly, impossibly beautiful that Marina sometimes had to remind herself to breathe normally in his presence. "A court-bonded witness," he said, "is not a protected guest. A court-bonded witness is formally woven into the politics of the court. Any enemy of mine becomes formally an enemy of theirs. Any challenge to my sovereignty becomes a challenge to their safety. The designation protects you legally under blood law, yes, but it also puts you at the center of every power struggle this court contains. Aldrich is not the only one who would use you against me, and not designating me," Marina said carefully. means Aldrich can continue to argue that I am an illegal civilian with dangerous knowledge, which he can use to force the High Council to remove me from court access entirely. And you lose your authenticated witness testimony about his forged territorial claim. Konstantin turned from the window. You understand exactly what is happening. I have been trying to understand exactly what is happening since the moment you walked into the Callaway Gallery 6 weeks ago and spent 40 minutes studying my paintings for asking me whether I had ever authenticated historical documents for a living. The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, something more careful than a smile. You were looking at me the entire time. You were worth looking at. And you were the only person in the room who understood what the paintings were actually about. He had been, Marina remembered with perfect clarity. The gallery opening had been for her newest series. Large-scale oil paintings that used architectural fragments, old maps, and handwritten text fragments embedded in layers of translucent glaze, exploring ideas about memory and historical erasure. Every other person at that opening had talked about the visual texture or the color palette. Konstantin Wehr had stood in front of the largest piece for a very long time and then said, quietly, without looking at her yet, "The documents you have layered into the lower third are legal writs, 18th century. The handwriting is consistent with a notarial tradition that died out in Central Europe after the Napoleonic reorganization of the courts. Either you are extraordinarily educated in historical legal scripts, or these are authentic documents, and you understand exactly what you have buried in this painting." And Marina had said, both. And he had looked at her then for the first time. That had been the beginning. What followed that first meeting was not what Marina had expected, which, she reflected, was the recurring theme of her entire experience with Konstantin Wehr. She had expected, perhaps, a commission. A wealthy and unusual collector wanted something painted. That happened. She had experience navigating the particular demands of wealthy and unusual collectors. She had not expected to spend the first 3 days in a series of long conversations that ranged across art history, the philosophy of memory and documentation, the ethics of witness testimony, and the nature of historical truth. She had not expected to find that those conversations were the most genuinely engaging she had had in years. She had not expected Konstantin to be careful with her, precise with her, to ask questions rather than pronounce, to listen with the quality of attention that most people had lost entirely in the age of phone notifications. She had not expected to like him before she feared him. But she had, on the 4th day, he had told her what he was. She had looked at him across his desk for a very long time, and then she had said, "The absence of a visible heartbeat, the temperature of your hands, the way you have never once eaten or drunk anything in my presence." The Klimt. The documents in your personal archive that I recognized as being in handwriting styles 4 centuries apart, but written by the same hand. She had paused. "How old are you?" 412 years, he had said. "I was born in what is now Romania in the Carpathian tradition, which is the oldest surviving vampire lineage in the world. And you need me because I need a human witness whose documentation of authentic court records will be considered credible by both the Vampire High Council and, if it comes to it, by human legal institutions. The dispute Aldrich is mounting threatens the territorial sovereignty of this court. If he wins his challenge before the High Council, the resulting instability will affect thousands of vampires and hundreds of humans who live and work within the court's protection networks without knowing it. I need someone who can look at documents and tell the truth about them without being manipulated by vampire politics. Why a human specifically? Because a vampire witness can be compelled by blood law. A human witness operating under the Compact of Vale's protections for acknowledged court-adjacent civilians cannot be compelled by anything short of direct physical threat. You would be, legally speaking, untouchable. Marina had thought about that for a moment. Aldrich found a way to put a blade to my throat. Aldrich found a way tonight because I underestimated his willingness to violate the compact openly. That was my error, not yours, and it will not happen again. The weight of that statement, the absolute certainty behind it, was something she had turned over in her mind many times in the weeks since. The High Council hearing was scheduled for 3 days after Aldrich's petition. Konstantin filed his response the same night, formally designating Marina as a court-bonded witness and advocate, and what followed those 3 days was something Marina had not fully anticipated. An education, not the kind of education one received in preparation for testimony. Constantin did not simply brief her on what to say. He sat with her for hours each day and explained the full architecture of the court, its alliances and enmities, the specific personalities of each council member, the particular points of pride and vulnerability that 2 centuries of vampire politics had carved into each of them. He explained blood law with the precision of someone who had spent centuries watching it be weaponized, and he explained its loopholes with the weariness of someone who had watched those loopholes kill people he cared about. He also explained, on the second evening, over the first meal he had ever shared with her in the literal sense, watching her eat while he drank from a glass of something deeply crimson that she had decided not to ask about, why he had chosen her specifically. "I attended 6 gallery openings," he said. "I read every interview you had ever given. I reviewed your authentication work for the estate lawyer you assisted 2 years ago on the Hargreaves collection dispute. I was looking for someone with specific qualities. Stubbornness," Marina said. "Integrity," he said. "Courage. The particular kind of intelligence that does not panic under pressure but instead accelerates. And someone with no connection to vampire court politics whatsoever, no allegiances, no old debts, no hidden motives that Aldrich could find and exploit. You did a great deal of research before you walked into that gallery. I do not make careless choices with other people's safety." Marina had looked at him then, really looked at him, and said, "You are worried about this hearing." The pause before he answered told her everything. Aldrich has allies on the High Council. 2 of the 7 councillors have territorial interests that align with his challenge. If my authenticated document is dismissed, he wins the challenge by default. I lose sovereignty over the Eastern Territories. 3 vampire families who have been under my protection for 60 years lose their standing. And the human networks we quietly maintain, the shelters, the medical programs, the documentation support for undocumented humans who have fallen into protection arrangements with court families, all of that loses its funding and its legal cover. Marina set down her fork. "You run humanitarian programs. I run programs that allow people to survive. I do not advertise them. Why not? Because the Vampire Court is not a charity organization. Advertising's humanitarian work would invite challenges from council members who regard human welfare as irrelevant at best and politically dangerous at worst. I fund these programs through my territorial holdings and operate them quietly because the alternative is not operating them at all." Marina had been quiet for a long time after that. Then she had said, "Tell me everything about the council members who oppose you. Their histories, their specific grievances, their pressure points. Not to manipulate them, to understand them. Because if I am going to stand in that chamber and tell the truth, I want to understand the exact space the truth needs to fill." He had looked at her with that expression she still did not quite have a name for, and then he had begun to talk. The High Council chamber was Marina Thurot, possibly the most intimidating room she had ever stood in, and she had once presented her graduate thesis to a jury of 7 art historians, who had 3 of them despised her faculty advisor, and 2 of them had pre-written their critiques before seeing her work. That had been bad. This was several calibrations beyond bad. The chamber was beneath the city, older even than the main court, carved from bedrock that predated the European settlement of Manhattan. Its walls covered in an intricate system of sigils that Marina recognized as a blend of Carpathian and Ottoman blood inscription traditions from her reading of the archive documents. 7 vampires sat at a curved stone table, white-haired and ancient, dressed in a mixture of modern and historical garments that somehow combined without jarring, because when you were several centuries old, Marina supposed, aesthetic consistency became its own kind of authority. Aldrich stood to the left side of the chamber with his advocate, a vampire named Seravath, who moved like a legal instrument given flesh, precise and cold and perpetually calculating. Constantin stood to the right, alone. Because court-bonded witnesses stood apart from the party they served in order to demonstrate independence, Marina stood in the center of the chamber, on the witness mark, which was a circular inlay of pale stone surrounded by carved text she had read 3 times and understood to be a formal declaration of protected testimony status, meaning that any physical threat to a witness standing on this mark was considered a capital violation of blood law, even by a council member. It was, she had thought when Constantin explained this, an elegant solution to the problem of terrifying witnesses into silence. You could not compel them. You could only argue against their words. She intended to make arguing against her words as difficult as possible. The High Council eldest, a vampire named Dorvath, whose age Marina estimated at somewhere between 6 and 7 centuries based on the documentation she had reviewed, called the chamber to order with a single word that resonated in the stone walls like a struck bell. Aldrich's advocate went first. Serevath was thorough, methodical, and deeply skilled at making facts sound like opinions and opinions sound like established law. He argued that the document Marina had recovered from the archive was not simply forged but had been planted, placed in the archive recently by persons acting under Constantin's direction, and that Marina herself was not an independent witness but a coached instrument of a territorial lord with a vested interest in the outcome. He argued that the Compact of Vale had been violated before Constantin's emergency designation, rendering that designation legally retroactive and therefore suspect. He argued with elegant regret that the High Council was obligated to consider whether Constantin's judgment regarding both territorial management and the handling of human civilians was fundamentally compromised. Marina listened to all of it with her hands still at her sides and her face neutral, and she catalogued every factual claim, every logical gap, every moment where Serevath substituted implication for evidence. When it was her turn to address the council, the silence in the chamber was absolute. "I am Marina Davenport," she said. I am a professional artist, and I have worked as a document authenticator in a consulting capacity for 4 legal firms and 2 estate resolution proceedings over the past 6 years. I hold a graduate degree in art history with a focus on historical documentation and materials analysis. I have no prior connection to this court, to Lord Vere, or to any party in this proceeding beyond my designation 6 days ago as court-bonded witness and advocate. She paused, making brief eye contact with each council member in turn, which she had been told was either very brave or very inadvisable, depending on which council member you were looking at. The document at the center of this hearing was located by me during a routine archival review I was conducting under Lord Vere's seal of access, 3 weeks into my work with the court archive. It was not presented to me. I found it while cross-referencing a series of territorial boundary notations from the 1880s against secondary sources in the same archive. I recognized its significance because I had spent the previous 2 weeks cataloging related materials and had developed a thorough understanding of the documentary record of this court from that period. She placed a hand on the documents she carried, the authentication report she had spent 40 hours preparing, with every methodological step documented and every piece of comparative evidence laid out with the precision of someone who knew that the only defense against claims of fabrication was an account so complete and so detailed that fabrication would have required more work than the truth. "I will now walk through the material evidence for this document's authenticity," she said, "and I would ask the council to note that I am doing so not because I was asked to by Lord Vere, who in fact advised me 3 days ago that the decision about how to present this evidence was entirely mine to make, but because I examined this document myself. I know what it is, and I believe the truth of what I found is relevant to this proceeding and to the well-being of the people this court governs." She had not planned to say that last part. It came out of something more direct than planning. The council was very still. She walked them through every detail. The watermark analysis cross-referenced against 12 authenticated samples, the ink composition, compared against archival records she herself had catalogued, the handwriting analysis of all 3 witness signatures on the document, placed beside authenticated exemplars from the same hands in other records, the chain of documentary custody traced through the archive's own registration system, which showed the document had been catalogued in 1932 by an archivist whose own signature appeared in court records from the same decade. She had been speaking for 40 minutes when Councillor Aldoth One of the two council members Constantin had identified as aligned with Aldrich's territorial interests interrupted. "You are describing a great deal of technical evidence," Aldoth said, his voice carrying the particular dismissive politeness of someone who had spent several centuries being important. "But a skilled forger could produce all of this. The question is not whether you believe the document is authentic. The question is whether your belief is reliable, given that you have spent the past 6 weeks in very close proximity to the party this document benefits." Marina looked at Aldoth for a moment. "Councillor," she said, "you have been a member of this court since the 1850s. In that time you have voted in 11 major territorial hearings. I have reviewed the record of every one of those votes in the archive documents Lord Vere gave me access to, and I have noticed that in 8 of those 11 hearings your vote aligned with the territorial interests of the parties who occupied the northern districts before Lord Vere's family took sovereignty in that region 2 centuries ago. I mention this not to suggest that your judgment is compromised. I mention it because there's questions about the proximity of a party to the matter being decided apply to everyone in this room, not only to me." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the previous ones. Aldoth sat back very slowly. Marina turned back to the full council. "I have placed my full authentication methodology in the record. Every step is documented. Every comparative source is identified and accessible for independent review. If the Council wishes to commission an independent authentication review by a separate expert, I would welcome that because the result would be the same. This document is authentic. The territorial treaty it records was never disputed by the original parties, and the claim that is the basis of Lord Aldrich's challenge is, based on this evidence, without foundation." She had one more thing to say, and she had debated whether to say it for 3 days, and had decided the morning of the hearing that silence was not the kind of truth she was capable of. "I would also like the Council to understand what is actually at stake in this hearing beyond the territorial question. Lord Vere administers programs that provide shelter, medical care, and documentation support to approximately 430 humans in this city who exist in legally precarious situations and who are protected by arrangements with families of this court. I know this because I have reviewed the program records, which I maintained in the same archive I have been working in, and because Lord Vere did not hide them from me, which is itself relevant evidence of his character and his intentions. If this challenge succeeds and he loses territorial sovereignty, those programs lose their operational foundation. That is the human consequence of this hearing. I believe this council should know it." She stepped back from the center of the chamber and returned to the witness mark and was quiet. The council deliberated for 3 hours. Marina sat in an antechamber with a cup of tea that a court attendant had brought her, and she thought about all the ways the deliberation could go. And she thought about Constantin's face when she had read aloud her statement about the protection programs in preparation the night before. And he had said, very quietly, "You do not have to say that," and she had said, "I know. I want to." Constantin came to the antechamber door when the deliberation ended. She read the outcome in his face before he said a word, because she had spent 6 weeks studying that carefully controlled face, and she knew now what it looked like when something had broken through the control. "The challenge is dismissed," he said. "Full territorial sovereignty confirmed. Aldrich is ordered to appear before the council for a formal accounting of his petition's factual basis." He paused. "Marina, yes. What you said about the programs, you did not have to. You said that last night. My answer has not changed." He crossed the antechamber in 3 steps, and she thought for one vertiginous second that he was going to touch her face. But he stopped with perhaps a foot of space between them, which was close enough that she was very aware of the height of him and the cool, faint electricity of his presence. That quality she had noticed from the first day that was not warmth exactly, but was something that moved in the same direction. "Why did you come back tonight?" he asked. "After Aldrich put a blade to your throat. You had the document, you had every justification to go to the council independently, file your testimony, and remove yourself from direct danger. Instead, you came back to the court. You came back to this building. Why?" Marina looked at him, at those silver eyes that had seen 4 centuries of human history, at that face that was too beautiful and too careful and too lonely for anyone to look at directly without feeling the loneliness like a physical thing. Because someone needed to make sure you were all right, she said, and also because I was not finished. The weeks that followed the hearing were different from the weeks before. Not quieter, because Aldrich was neither subdued nor gracious in defeat, and the accounting hearing the council had ordered produced a cascade of smaller legal challenges and counterpetitions that kept Konstantin's advocate working at a pace that made even ancient vampires look tired. But different in the particular texture of the time Marina spent in the court, and in the building, and in Konstantin's company. She had stayed. That was the first different thing. Her formal designation as court-bonded witness was now firmly established and legally unassailable, and Konstantin had told her clearly that she was no longer obligated to remain, that her work for the hearing was complete, that she could return to her studio and her gallery and her ordinary life, with the court's formal protection extending to her indefinitely as a matter of established blood law. She had stayed, she told herself, for about a week, that she was staying because there was still archival work to finish, which was true, because she had identified 3 additional documentary inconsistencies in the archive that seemed relevant to Aldrich's pattern of territorial manipulation, and she wanted to complete that analysis before she handed it off to the court's legal team. That was real work with real value, and she was good at it, but she also spent the evenings in Konstantin's study, not working, and those evenings were something she found she could not quite make herself give up. He taught her to read the older Carpathian blood script, because she had expressed curiosity about the sigils in the council chamber, and he had, without apparent premeditation, simply begun to explain them. And they had spent 4 evenings working through the foundational grammar of a reading system that was, Marina thought, extraordinarily beautiful in its visual logic. He told her about the city he had been born in, which did not exist in that form anymore, and the mountains above it, and the court his father had held, and the night 4 centuries ago when everything about that life had ended. She told him about growing up in a small house in Vermont with parents who were both schoolteachers and who had treated every weekend as an opportunity for a minor educational expedition, and about the particular terror and freedom of arriving in New York at 22, with a portfolio and no contacts and the absolute conviction that she was going to make something that mattered. She told him about the failed relationship at 25 with a fellow artist who had been brilliant and impossible to live with, and the quieter, lonelier years after that when she had understood that she was probably going to be someone who loved deeply and rarely, and had made her peace with that. Konstantin listened to all of it with the quality of attention that still, even after weeks, made her feel like the most interesting person in whatever room they occupied. One evening she was working at the secondary desk in his study, cross-referencing a set of boundary documents against a cadastral survey from the 1890s, and she became aware that he had stopped working and was looking at her, not with the political calculation she had learned to read in his court face, but with something quieter and more unguarded. "What?" she said, without looking up. "I was thinking," he said, "about what it was like before you were here." She did look up at that. It was, he said very carefully in the way he spoke when something cost him, a great deal more quiet, in ways that were not comfortable. Marina set down her pen. "Konstantin, I am 412 years old," he said, and it came out like an acknowledgement of something he had been working toward. "And I have been very careful for most of that time about the difference between what I want and what is wise. I have watched people age and die. I have watched cities rise and fall. I have watched every human connection I have ever allowed myself eventually become a loss. I have been, for the past century or so, very committed to limiting the depth of those connections." "And now?" Marina asked, because she was not going to pretend she did not understand what he was saying. "Now I find that limiting the depth of this particular connection is not something I am capable of managing with any consistency," he said. "And I am aware that this is an extraordinary imposition to place on you. You have a life that extends forward in time in ways mine does not. You will want things that are complicated by proximity to my world, and I am not, by any reasonable measure, a straightforward person to care about." "No," Marina agreed. "You are also not a boring one." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am a person who makes decisions carefully," she said, rising from the desk and crossing the study toward him, because she had been making this decision quietly for weeks, and she was not someone who made careful decisions and then failed to act on them. "I looked at every reasonable obstacle before committing to anything. I am aware of the complications. I am aware of the grief that is probably built into caring about someone who is not going to age or diminish in ways I eventually will. I am aware that your court is full of people who will view me as a vulnerability and try to use that to reach you." She stopped in front of him. He had risen from his chair at some point, and he was very close, and she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him. And his eyes were the particular silver that they went when he was feeling something he was not attempting to control. "I have looked at all of it," she said, "and my conclusion is that I am not willing to manage the depth of this connection either." He reached up and touched her face, then, finally, with a hand that was cool and very gentle, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with the exact precision of someone who had been thinking about doing exactly this for a very long time. "You are the most dangerous person I have ever invited into my court," he said, very softly. "And I mean that entirely as the highest praise I am capable of." She closed the remaining distance and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the quality of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and intended to be thorough about it now that the waiting was over. Outside the window, Manhattan moved through its perpetual, indifferent midnight, and the city above the court carried on in perfect ignorance of the ancient and complicated heart, beating faster than usual in the 34th floor of a building it would never think twice about. The peace lasted approximately 3 weeks. It was not Aldrich who broke it, which surprised Marina because she had expected Aldrich. The accounting hearing had gone badly for him. 2 of the territorial claims he had built his challenge on had been exposed as resting on documents he had himself commissioned under false pretenses, and the council was now examining the full scope of his territorial activity over the past 50 years, with an attention that had made his face, when Marina had last seen it in the council antechamber, look like someone performing composure over the surface of real panic. No, what broke the peace was older than Aldrich. It arrived in the form of a sealed message delivered to the court by a courier whose clothing was dark and old-fashioned, in a way that made the guards nervous. A message that Constantin read once, standing in the entrance hall, and then read again with the particular stillness that Marina had learned to associate with something that required all of his control to receive without visible reaction. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up. "The Carpathian Conclave," he said. "The gathering of the oldest vampire lines. It convenes every 50 years, and it is convening in 6 weeks. I am required to attend." That sounds manageable. The message is not an ordinary summons. It is a formal challenge. "Someone has filed a claim before the conclave that my management of the North American court represents a violation of the ancient codes of sovereignty. Specifically," he said, folding the letter with precision, "that I have allowed a human civilian to develop operational knowledge of vampire court law and to advocate in court proceedings on behalf of a vampire lord, which the challenger claims is a violation of the Compact of Vale at a level that only the conclave has jurisdiction to adjudicate." Marina felt the specific chill of someone who has just recognized their own name in a document they are not supposed to have access to. "They are making it about me. They are making it about us," he said. "Yes. Who filed it?" "The signature is Aldrich's. But Aldrich does not have standing before the conclave. Someone older and more powerful filed this on his behalf. Someone who has been watching this court for a reason I have not yet determined." The preparation for the conclave was different from the preparation for the council hearing, because the conclave was not a proceeding Marina could walk into as a witness. The conclave met in Europe, in a location she would not know until 48 hours before departure, and it operated under protocols that had been established before the existence of the United States. Her designation as court-bonded witness, which had been her legal protection in the local court, had been granted under North American blood law. Before the conclave, she had no formal standing at all. Constantine explained this to her with the careful precision he always used when delivering information that had unpleasant implications, and she could see that he was working through how to tell her the next part. "You are not required to come," he said. The challenge is against me, not you. Your presence is not compulsory. But if I arrive at the conclave without you, the challenger will argue that my willingness to leave you behind proves that you are not genuinely court-bonded, that the designation was tactical rather than genuine, and the case against me becomes stronger. And if I come, if you come, you are walking into a chamber where you have no legal protection under established codes, and where every vampire present is, at minimum, 500 years old, and most of them have complicated feelings about humans who have developed any influence in vampire courts. Marina thought about this for a long moment. What is the actual worst case? If the conclave rules against me, I lose sovereignty over this court. The territorial holdings revert to conclave administration. The protection programs end. The families under my protection lose their standing. He paused. And under conclave authority, your court-bonded designation would be retroactively voided, which, under the oldest interpretation of the Compact of Vale, would mean you had been an unprotected human with operational knowledge of court law for the entire duration of your time here. Which would make me subject to the old silencing protocols, Marina said quietly, because she had read enough of the archive to know what those protocols historically meant. Yes. So if the conclave rules against you, what happens to me is extremely bad. Yes, and if you go without me, the case is weaker. And if you go with me, I am in the room when potentially extremely bad things happen. Yes, but if you do not go at all, if a summoned lord does not appear before the conclave, it is treated as an admission of the charge. The ruling is automatic and immediate. Marina nodded slowly. There is no version of this where you do not go. No. Then there is no version of this where I let you go without me. He looked at her for a long moment. Marina, I am not, she said with complete calm. A person who sends someone I love into a dangerous situation alone when I have information and skills that are directly relevant to the challenge they are facing. She said the word love, as she said most important things, with full awareness of its weight and complete steadiness. Where is the conclave held? The conclave convened in a castle in the Carpathian Mountains that made every other vampire building Marina had ever seen look young. It was not hidden beneath a city. It stood openly on a mountain ridge, because it had stood there long enough that human cartography had simply learned to leave the relevant coordinates blank. She arrived with Constantin and two of his senior court guardians, Reza and Malekith, who had been with him for over a century each, and who treated Marina with a respectful wariness that she had come to understand as the closest thing to warmth that ancient vampire protocol permitted towards someone in her position. The journey was a private flight followed by a drive that took them into mountains, where the road narrowed to something that might once have been a goat path, and the forest pressed in close and dark on either side, and then suddenly the path opened and the castle was above them, lit by torches that burned with a cold blue flame that cast no warmth at all. Marina had brought her documentation. All of it, the full archive of authenticated materials, the complete record of her methodology, and 3 additional documents she had finished analyzing in the final week before departure that she believed were the most important things she had found in the entire archive, because they predated everything else and they told a story about the conclave itself that she suspected no one currently alive had expected her to find. She had not told Constantin about those 3 documents yet. She had been working on them in the small hours of consecutive sleepless nights, cross-referencing against materials she had requested from the archive through channels that kept the request off the main registry log, because she had needed to be certain before she said anything. And now she was certain. The conclave chamber was everything the Manhattan Council chamber was not. Ancient, vast, open to the mountain air through windows that had been cut directly through the stone, lit by those cold blue flames, populated by 12 vampires who collectively represented more years of continuous existence than the entire recorded history of human civilization. They sat at a table of dark stone that Marina estimated was at least 8 centuries old, dressed in a combination of historical and contemporary clothing that somehow managed to feel entirely of one piece. The challenger was not Aldrich. Marina had known that. But she had not known, until she walked into the room, who it was. The vampire who had filed the challenge was named Vorith. He was the oldest non-conclave vampire in the northern European territories, and he had been a rival to Constantine's bloodline for 2 centuries over territorial boundaries that no longer existed as political entities, but still mattered enormously in the internal accounting of vampire sovereignty. He was tall and white-haired like all of them, but his eyes were colorless in a way that Constantine's silver eyes were not, flat and ancient and empty of anything that felt like personality, and Marina understood immediately that he was not interested in the question of blood law or the Compact of Vale. He was interested in removing Constantine, and the legal challenge was the instrument. Voruth's presentation to the conclave was designed to accomplish 2 things simultaneously: establish that Constantine had violated the ancient codes by allowing a human to exercise advocacy functions in a vampire court, and establish that Constantine's attachment to this particular human represented a fundamental compromising of his judgment that made him unfit for sovereign administration. He was elegant about it. He did not say love like it was sentimental. He said it like it was a diagnosis. Marina sat in the observer's position, which was the only position available to her in the conclave chamber, and listened and thought. She had one chance. She knew that. The conclave did not operate like the Manhattan Council. It did not extend formal speaking rights to human observers. The only way she could introduce anything into the proceedings was if a conclave elder directly addressed her with a question, which was an extremely unusual and entirely discretionary act, or if she found a way to invoke a right of ancient witness, so specific and so rarely used that she had only discovered it existed because of the 3 documents she had found in the final week before the journey. The right of historical witness. It was established in the oldest Carpathian blood law texts, predating the conclave itself, and it stated that any person in possession of direct documentary evidence bearing on a proceeding before the conclave had an inviolable right to present that evidence, regardless of their species or standing, provided the evidence met a specific threshold of historical significance. The threshold was the critical element, because the oldest codes defined historical significance as evidence that bore directly on the founding history of the conclave itself, or the legitimacy of its current authority. The 3 documents Marina had found were exactly that. She waited. She listened to Voruth finish his presentation, and she watched Constantine respond with the precision and dignity she would have expected from him. But she could read the tension in the line of his shoulders, and she knew that what he was presenting, while legally correct, was insufficient to overcome the weight of Voruth's ancient authority and his 2 conclave allies. She stood up. The room went very still. Reza, standing near the door, made a sharp movement that she felt rather than saw. "I invoke the right of historical witness," Marina said, in the oldest Carpathian blood law formulation. She had spent 2 weeks learning to pronounce correctly. "Under the founding accord of the conclave, Article 7, I invoke the right of direct documentary evidence on a matter bearing on the founding history and continuing legitimacy of this body." The silence in the chamber had a different quality than any silence Marina had encountered before. It was the silence of 12 creatures who had each lived long enough to have forgotten more history than she would ever know, and who had just heard someone cite a legal provision that most of them had probably not heard invoked in their living memory. The conclave elder, whose name was Serath and whose age Marina estimated at close to 900 years, looked at her with eyes the color of deep water. "You are a human," Serath said. "The founding accord does not restrict the right of historical witness by species," Marina said. "It was written before the Compact of Vale and supersedes it on matters of conclave authority. The specific language is as follows." She recited it from memory. Serath looked at her for a very long time. Then Serath said, "Present your evidence." Marina placed the 3 documents on the table in front of her with her full authentication analysis, and she walked the conclave through what she had found. The documents were letters, 460 years old, written by the founder of the conclave itself, in the same hand she had learned to recognize from other authenticated materials, and they described, in clear and unambiguous language, the specific circumstances under which the founder had established the Compact of Vale, and the reason for its particular provisions regarding human access to vampire court knowledge. The reason was not what Vorith had spent his presentation arguing. The Compact of Vale had not been established to prevent humans from having operational knowledge of vampire courts, because such knowledge was dangerous to vampire security. It had been established, as the founder's own letters made explicit, to prevent vampire lords from using human civilians as disposable political instruments. The provision against human advocacy in vampire courts was not designed to protect vampires from humans. It was designed to protect humans from being placed in harm's way by vampire lords who valued political outcomes over human lives. The court-bonded witness and advocate designation was precisely the mechanism the founder had intended as the exception to this protective provision. A formal declaration that the vampire lord in question accepted full legal responsibility for the human's safety elevated them to a status of genuine political personhood within the court structure and could not subsequently claim ignorance or non-involvement in any harm that came to them. It was not a violation of the Compact of Vale. It was the specific instrument the Compact's author had created to allow trusted human-vampire collaboration to occur honorably. Marina had been speaking for over an hour when she stopped. Vorith had not moved in that hour. He was looking at the documents with the expression of someone calculating odds at great speed and finding none of them favorable. Seirath looked at the documents, then at Marina, then at Constantin. "These documents were in the court archive under your custody," Sarah said to Constantin. "They were," Constantin said. "I was not aware of their specific content. I gave my witness open access to the archive because her judgment in documentary matters is superior to mine, and I trusted her to use that access well." "You trusted a human," Vorith said, and there was something in his voice now that was no longer elegant. "I trusted," Constantin said with a quietness that filled the entire chamber, "a specific and extraordinary person. Yes." Seirath looked at Marina for a long moment. "How did you find these letters?" "I recognized that a series of filing tags in the archive used a notation system that predated all the other materials I had catalogued. I followed the system backwards through the archive's organizational history until I found the earliest layer of documentation. These letters were at the foundation of that layer. They appeared to have been there since the archive's establishment." Marina paused. "I believe they were placed there deliberately by someone who intended them to be found. I believe whoever organized the archive originally knew what these letters contained and preserved them exactly here, at the base of everything, so that they would be available to anyone willing to look." Seirath was quiet for a very long time. Then Seirath turned to the full conclave. The deliberation took less time than the Manhattan Council hearing had. 40 minutes later, Seirath spoke the ruling. The challenge was dismissed. The right of historical witness was formally affirmed and entered into the conclave record as an established precedent. The court-bonded witness and advocate designation was confirmed as a legitimate instrument of the Compact of Vale when applied in accordance with the original terms. Vorith was formally censured for filing a challenge in bad faith, leveraging a misreading of the founding codes that the elder noted with an asperity that made Marina think Seirath had probably been extremely unpleasant in 900 years of political disputes. He should have known to be incorrect. It was over. They were outside the castle on the mountain path, in the cold and clean mountain air that smelled like pine and stone, and the city lights of Manhattan were very far away and very irrelevant. And Marina was standing with her face turned up toward the sky, because, after everything that had happened in that chamber, she needed a moment of looking at something that was simply itself, uncomplicated, not making any demands on her attention. Constantin came to stand beside her. "The 3 documents," he said. "You worked on those in the nights before we left." "Yes, you did not tell me what you had found. I needed to be certain first. And I did not want you to carry the information before I was certain, because if I had been wrong, it would have been a distraction you did not need." He was quiet for a moment. The mountain dark was around them, cold and wide, and the blue-flamed torches of the castle threw long shadows across the path. "You stood up in that chamber," he said, "with no formal standing, no legal protection. 12 ancient vampires who had no particular reason to listen to you. And you invoked a legal right that has not been exercised in recorded memory." "I had done my research," Marina said. "Marina." She looked at him. If Seirath had not recognized the founding accord provision, If the elder had refused the right of historical witness, there would have been no recourse. You would have been removed from the chamber, and the ruling would have proceeded without your evidence. I know, she said. I considered that possibility, and you stood up anyway. The documents were authentic and the argument was correct, she said simply. In my experience, when you have something true to say and the right exists to say it, you stand up and say it. The alternative is letting something false win because the true thing was inconvenient or risky to present. He looked at her for a long moment, and the moonlight was on his white hair and his silver eyes, and his face had none of the careful control of the court in it. It was fully open, fully present, the way it was when they were alone, and the politics of every ancient institution had fallen away. You said, he told her, very quietly, in the council chamber in Manhattan, that someone needed to make sure I was all right. And tonight you invoked a 900-year-old legal provision in front of the oldest governing body of the vampire world on my behalf. He reached for her hand. I have been alive for 412 years. I have never had anyone defend me. I have had allies, advocates, instruments of political alliance. I have never had someone who simply, without calculation or obligation, placed themselves in the room when the room was dangerous, because they believed in the truth of what they were defending. Marina turned her hand over in his, feeling the cool and steady weight of his fingers. You do the same, she said. For 400 people in New York who has never seen your face, you keep programs running so that they are safe. You spend centuries being careful and controlled and politically necessary so that the people under your protection stay protected. You have been defending people quietly for so long that you have perhaps forgotten that you are allowed to be defended in return. He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes on hers, and then he said something in Carpathian that she had learned enough to understand. I did not know you were possible. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her, there on the mountain path in the cold, clear night, with the genuine stillness of someone who had finally stopped bracing for something to be taken away. They returned to Manhattan 2 days later. The castle at dawn had been extraordinary. The first pale light touching the mountain peaks while the castle itself remained in shadow, and Marina had stood at the high window of the guest chamber and drawn it from memory in the small sketchbook she carried everywhere, and Constantin had watched her work for a long time, with his arms folded and an expression of complete quiet attention that she was going to have to paint someday, that exact look, the way someone ancient and complicated and deeply private looked when they had stopped being careful for a moment. The return to the court was not a triumphant procession. It was simply a return, practical and quiet, to the ongoing business of running an ancient institution in a modern city. There were messages waiting, legal filings to review, the ongoing accounting of Aldrich's activities, which had revealed a pattern of territorial manipulations extending back 40 years, and was now the subject of a formal conclave inquiry that would keep vampire lawyers busy for the foreseeable future. There were the protection program reports Marina had been asked to help restructure for improved documentation, because it turned out that being court-bonded meant her skills had about 17 immediate practical applications that Constantine's team had been waiting to make use of. Riza, the senior court guardian, had stopped treating Marina with cautious wariness somewhere between the Carpathian mountain road and the return flight, and had shifted to something that Marina was fairly confident was the vampire equivalent of deep respect, which expressed itself primarily as Reza appearing silently at Marina's elbow whenever she was about to walk into a room that contained a political situation, and providing a two-sentence briefing with the efficiency of Lond, someone who had decided that a human who invoked 900-year-old conclave law deserved to know exactly what she was walking into. Malakith, the other guardian, had given Marina a book. It was very old in Carpathian blood script, which she could now read, and it was a history of the court from its founding. When she had looked up from examining it and found Malakith watching her, the vampire had said, with complete solemnity, "You should know the full history of the thing you are part of." Marina had thought that was one of the most dignified gifts she had ever received. 3 months after the conclave, the protection programs had been restructured with Marina's documentation system and had been expanded, because the legal clarity the conclave ruling had created around the court-bonded designation had allowed Constantine to formalize certain arrangements that had previously had to remain informal for legal safety. The number of people covered had grown from 430 to over 600. Marina had spent a week working with the court's human liaison team on the new intake documentation and had come home at midnight each of those nights to find Constantine waiting in the study with food she had not thought to eat and the particular quality of attention that made her feel, every time, like the most important thing in whatever room they occupied. On the evening they finalized the new program structure, he took her to the roof of the building, which was not a place she had been before, a flat expanse of dark stone that looked directly over the canyon of Midtown Manhattan, the towers lit and restless, the city its own kind of ancient power, indifferent and magnificent. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future." Marina leaned on the parapet and looked at the city. "What specifically? You have a life that extends forward in time," he said, as he had said once before. But now it came out differently, without the weight of warning. It came out like a question looking for an answer, and I have been thinking about what it would mean if you wanted to formalize that. You're standing in the court, your place here. He paused. Your place with me. Marina turned to look at him. He was looking at the city, not at her, in the precise way she recognized as what he did when he was saying something that cost him maximum exposure. "Are you asking me to stay?" she asked. "I am asking you," he said carefully. "Whether staying is something you want. I will not ask you to set aside anything your life requires. I am aware that I cannot offer you some things that a human life with a human partner would offer. I age differently than you do. The world I inhabit has dangers that are not hypothetical. The political complexity of this court is not going to simplify because we would prefer it to." He finally looked at her. "But I am also aware that what exists between us is not something I am willing to pretend is smaller than it is, and I have spent 400 years being honest with myself about large and inconvenient truths." Marina was quiet for a moment. The city noise rose faintly from 34 floors below, and the November air was cold and clear, and the lights of the towers made the sky above them a deep, warm grey. "I want," she said, "to keep doing work that matters. I want to keep making art. I want to keep finding documents buried in archives that nobody else thought to look for and telling the truth about what they say." She turned toward him fully. "I also want this, specifically. You, this court. This work, this life that is strange and dangerous and more interesting than anything I had before it. I have thought about the complications the same way I always think about complications, which is thoroughly, in advance and with a list. The grief that is probably waiting somewhere ahead, the political exposure, the ways my life will not be ordinary." She took a step toward him. "And my conclusion is the same as it was before. I am not willing to manage the depth of this." Constantine reached for her, his hands framing her face with the same care he brought to everything that mattered to him, and he kissed her with the quality of permanence, the particular tenderness of something that has found its shape and knows it. "There is a formal designation," he said against her forehead after a long moment, "for a human who is not simply court-bonded but formally recognized as an integral member of the Lord's household, with the full weight of court protection and ancient blood law standing behind them. It is old. It has not been invoked in this court in 2 centuries. I know," Marina said. "I found it in the archive. It was in the same document layer as the conclave letters." He laughed, and it was the rare, genuine laugh she had only heard a handful of times, warm and surprised and entirely unguarded. "Of course you did. I did not bring it up," she said, "because I was waiting to see if you would. And if I had not, I would have mentioned it eventually, casually, in the middle of some other conversation. Probably while looking at a document so you could not see my face." He pulled her closer, and she settled against him, looking out at the city from the high parapet, his arm around her shoulders, his presence at her side, cool and solid and entirely steady. "Stay," he said simply. Not a question now. Something warmer than a question. "Yes," she said. Equally simply, the winter that followed was the kind of winter that felt like a beginning. Marina moved the essential parts of her studio into the court building, into a space on the upper floors with north-facing sill windows that she had been eyeing for months, and that Constantine had converted with quiet efficiency into a working studio, before she had quite finished thinking the thought aloud. The Klimt hung in the study, and she had started a new series of paintings, large and complex, that used blood script fragments as a structural element, the sigil language she had learned woven into layers of architectural imagery and documentary texture. The first piece in the series was of the conclave chamber. She worked on it for 3 weeks, from memory and from the sketches she had made on the return journey. And when it was finished, she stood back and looked at it and thought that it was the most honest thing she had ever painted, because it contained both the terror of that room and the particular quality of what it felt like to stand in the center of it and say the true thing anyway. Constantin saw it one evening when she forgot to close the studio door and found him standing in the doorway, very still, looking at it. She watched him look at it for a long time. "You were not afraid," he said finally. "I was absolutely afraid," Marina said. "I was simply not willing to let that be the most important thing in the room." He came into the studio and stood beside her and looked at the painting and said nothing, which was the response she had come to know meant something was moving through him too deep and too complex for immediate words. She had started the second piece in the series, which was of the Manhattan Council Chamber, and the third would be the archive, and the fourth she was not sure about yet, except that it would have a mountain in it, and night air, and something true about what it felt like to be held by someone who had stopped expecting to be. Aldrich's formal accounting before the conclave concluded in the spring. The result was the loss of his European territorial holdings and a century-long restriction from court proceedings, which in human terms was a career ending and in vampire terms was somewhere in the range of an extremely serious professional setback. He was not, as Marina had half expected, dangerous in defeat, because it turned out that Aldrich's entire architecture of influence had rested on his territorial holdings, and without them, he was simply a very old vampire with a grudge and no leverage, which was a category of threat Constantin's court handled with administrative efficiency. Vorath was a different matter. The conclave censure had bitten, and he had spent the winter being very quiet in a way that experienced vampire political watchers apparently found more concerning than loud opposition. But the 3 months of silence had eventually resolved into a formal diplomatic approach to Constantin, channeled through the conclave elder Serath, which Constantin had discussed with Marina over dinner one evening, with the careful transparency he had developed as his natural mode of operating around her. "He wants to negotiate a territorial understanding," Constantin said. "A formal bilateral arrangement that would end the contested boundary claims going back 2 centuries. What does he want in exchange? Acknowledgement. Formal acknowledgement of his standing before the conclave as a territorial lord of equal precedence. He has never been formally accorded that acknowledgement by my bloodline. Because my bloodline has considered his bloodline a subordinate derivation of the Carpathian original for 200 years, and that view is held by enough of the conclave that it has never been formally challenged." He paused. "The view is, I should tell you, not entirely accurate. The historical documentation suggests that Vorath's bloodline diverged from the original Carpathian tradition approximately 1 generation before mine, not 1 generation after, which would mean the precedence relationship between us is considerably less clear than my bloodline has historically claimed." Marina set down her fork. "You know the historical documentation suggests this." "I was brought up knowing the historical documentation suggests this," Constantin said. "I was also brought up with a very clear framework for which documentation was considered authoritative and which was considered contestable. And the documentation I found in the archive last month," Marina said, because she had in fact found documentation in the archive last month and had been working through its implications for 3 weeks. "The genealogical records in the oldest layer of the archive, those support the earlier divergence interpretation." "Yes, you looked at what I found. Yes, and you did not bring it up because I was waiting," he said, with the faintest, warmest shadow of irony, "to see if you would." Marina put down her napkin. "The acknowledgement costs you your bloodline's claim to precedence over his. Yes, but it ends 200 years of territorial conflict and removes the primary structural motivation for him to continue opposing you Yes, yes, and it happens to be the accurate historical interpretation of the documented evidence. Yes, Marina considered. Then you should give it to him. I know, Constantin said. I have been thinking about how to do it in a way that does not simply read as capitulation. You frame it as correcting a historical record. You have documentation supporting the earlier divergent state. You present the acknowledgement as a court acting in accordance with newly reviewed evidence. That is not capitulation. That is the exact same thing I did in the conclave chamber. You tell the true thing. You let the truth do the work. He looked at her across the dinner table with an expression she had, by now catalogued well. The one where he was very quietly struck by something. You make it sound uncomplicated. It is not uncomplicated, but it is the right thing. And when something is the right thing, you do not make it complicated by attaching the wrong motives to it. She picked up her fork again. Write to Sarath. Frame it as a documentary historical review. I will authenticate the genealogical records so the evidentiary basis is solid. He did, and she did, and the negotiation with Vorith took 2 months, during which time Marina authenticated 7 historical records, expanded the protection program intake system to include a digital case management element that the court's human license team had been asking for since before she arrived, and finished the 4th painting in her series, which turned out to contain not only a mountain and night air, but 2 figures standing on a high parapet against a city sky, one of them dark-haired and very alive-looking, one of them white-haired and ancient, and looking at the city with something that could only be read as peace. When the territorial agreement with Vorith was signed in the early summer, Constantin put a copy of it in the archive himself, filed in the correct historical layer, documented in the registration system with full metadata. Then he came to find Marina in the studio, where she was working on the 5th piece in the series, which was turning into something she had not quite intended, and was becoming one of the truest things she had ever made. He stood in the doorway and watched her work, and she did not stop because she was in the middle of something, and he knew her well enough to wait. After a while, she set down the brush and turned around. Done, she said. The painting or the day? Both, I think. She looked at him, at the ease that had taken months to fully settle into the lines of his face. The way the 4-century-old control was still there, but sat differently now, not braced, not walling anything out. Vorith signed. Yes, the archive copy is filed. How do you feel? He considered the question with the genuine weight he brought to questions she actually wanted answered. Like something very old has been set down, he said. Correctly set down in the right place. Not dropped, not lost. Just placed where it belongs and released. Marina nodded slowly. There is going to be something else, she said, because there always was in this world. Some new challenge, some new political complication, some ancient grievance that resurfaces on a 50-year cycle. Yes, and you are not going to face it alone. No, he agreed, and the word had the weight of the formal designation she now held in the court records, and the weight of the archive document she had built into her paintings, and the weight of a mountain night and a high parapet and a city spread out below, like proof that the world kept moving forward, even when it was very, very complicated. He crossed the studio floor and kissed her the way he always kissed her now, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that time was not unlimited, even when you were 400 years old, because the person you were with had taught you that specific lesson by being irrevocably finite and irrevocably worth everything. I want to take you somewhere, he said. Not for court business, not for politics. I want to show you where I was born. The mountains. There is almost nothing left of the original city, but the mountains are exactly as they were. I have not been back in over a century. Marina looked at him. Why not? Because going back alone had no particular point. She understood that completely and held it for a moment, the weight of 100 years of not going home, because there was no one to go with, and felt the complicated, full, not entirely comfortable emotion that she had come to understand was simply what it felt like to love someone whose history was long enough to hurt. Then we will go, she said. After I finish the 5th painting, it is almost done. What is it? She turned it back to the canvas. It was large, nearly 2 meters across, oil on linen, built up in the layered glaze technique she used for things she wanted to have depth you had to look into rather than at. It showed an archive, Rows of shelves receding into warm amber light, and in the center foreground a document laid open on a reading table, and embedded in the document, visible only as you looked into the layers, were fragments of blood script and the specific, precise marks of an authentication review. "It is about the difference," she said, "between a document that proves something is true and a person who witnesses it. You can have the document without the witness, but the witness is what makes the truth of it real in the room." She looked at the canvas for a moment. "I have been thinking about witness as a form of love, paying attention to something so carefully and so honestly that your presence with it changes what it is capable of being." Constantine stood behind her and looked at the painting, and she could feel him understanding it in the exact way it was meant to be understood, which was the thing about him that had been true from the first evening in the gallery when he had stood in front of her work and seen it properly. "Finish it," he said, his voice quiet and warm behind her, "and then we will go to the mountains." She finished it 4 days later. She stood back and looked at it for a long time, and she thought it was the best thing she had made. And she thought she understood why, which was that for the first time in her life she was making work from inside a life that felt entirely, specifically hers. They went to the mountains in August, when the high meadows were green, and the rock faces above were the exact grey silver she had been carrying in her mind since the night of the conclave. And Constantine walked into the landscape of his oldest memory with the particular quality of a person setting something fragile down very gently and finding that it was still intact. He showed her the ridge where the original settlement had stood. There was forest there now, old-growth forest, the trees enormous and unhurried, with no trace of what had been there 4 centuries ago, except the shape of the land itself, the slope and the aspect and the way the light came through in the late afternoon. Marina stood in the middle of it with her sketchbook, and drew the trees and the light and the shape of the land. And Constantine stood nearby and watched her and said almost nothing. And the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. On the last evening before the return flight, they sat on a rock outcropping above a valley that was still, in this part of the Carpathians, almost entirely wild, and the sunset was extraordinary. The kind of atmospheric event that a painter could only witness and could not reproduce, because the reproduction would look like exaggeration, and Marina looked at it and felt the specific emotion of being exactly where she was supposed to be at exactly the moment she was supposed to be there. "I have something to tell you," Constantine said. She waited. "The Carpathian tradition," he said, "has a practice of formal binding. It is older than blood law, older than the conclave. It is a declaration before whatever one believes to be lasting, that 2 people recognize each other as essential. It has no legal standing in court proceedings. It carries no political implications. It is simply," he said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, a complete unguardedness that went all the way down. A person saying to another person that they are chosen. Deliberately, with full knowledge of everything. Marina looked at him. "I have been thinking about it," he said, "since the mountain in the conclave winter. Since you stood in that chamber and said the true thing. I have been thinking about it since the first evening in the gallery, when you looked at my documents, and told me you understood them, and I believed you immediately and completely, which I do not do. You want to do the binding," Marina said. "I want to ask if you want to," he said, precisely, because he was always precise. Marina looked at the valley and the extraordinary sunset, and she thought about 47 days in a court, and a blade at her throat, and a document recovered from an archive, and 3 letters at the bottom of a filing system that had changed everything, and a mountain night and a high parapet, and the sound of a laugh she had heard only rarely and treasured completely. "Yes," she said, for the second time, with the same steadiness she brought to all the large things. "Tell me what it requires." "It requires," he said, "that you mean it." "Then it requires nothing I do not already have," Marina said. He took her hands, there on the rock above the ancient valley, and he said the words in Carpathian, slowly, with the care of something that had been kept for a very long time, for exactly the right moment, and she listened and understood them and said them back. Imperfect in the ancient language, but true in every particular that mattered, because she was Marina Davenport, who looked at documents and told the truth about them, and The document of this moment was the most authentic thing she had ever seen. Below them, the valley was going blue in the late light. The mountains were exactly as they had been 400 years ago. Above them, the first stars were emerging, the same stars that had been there before any court or compact or blood law had existed, patient and indifferent and beautiful. Constantin held both her hands, and he looked at her with 4 centuries behind those silver eyes. And what she saw in his face was the thing she had been trying to name. Since the night he had walked through a door, with rain on his shoulders and murder in his eyes, and had spoken in a voice so quiet that everyone in the room understood immediately that he would not let anything in the world touch her, while there was breath in his body to prevent it. She had a name for it now. She'd had it for some time. She had simply been waiting for the moment to be exactly right before she acknowledged it out loud. Peace, she thought. It looked exactly like peace. They stayed on the mountain until the stars were fully out, and the valley below was dark, and the old forest at their backs held its deep, unhurried silence, and Marina leaned against the solid coolness of Constantin's shoulder, and thought about witness, about the difference between a document that proves something is true and a person who is present for it. She was present for this, every particular of it. The mountains and the stars and the ancient man beside her and the life that was going forward from this moment, complicated and political and dangerous and real and entirely, specifically hers, below them. Somewhere unreachably far away, Manhattan went on doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent, its courts and secrets humming in the bedrock far beneath its feet. The protection programs were running. The archive was organized. The documents were catalogued and authenticated and true, and Marina Davenport, who had walked into a vampire court with a sketchbook and an absolute commitment to looking at things honestly, had become something the ancient blood law texts had not quite had a word for. Not a witness to someone else's power, but a full and deliberate partner in the building of something worth protecting. She had known, from the moment she stood up in that conclave chamber with 12 ancient pairs of eyes on her, and the oldest legal provision in vampire history in her mouth, that she had stopped being a visitor. She had been something else since then. She was home.